Marek, welcome back to the Health Path podcast. It's I think you might be only our second guest who's made a return, so you're on a short list.
Sounds like a bit of an honor, so I'll do my best to live up to that.
So last time we spoke about the adrenals and adrenal function, and we had kind of a deep dive into some of the things that we need to be considering when thinking about adrenal function, cortisol testing, and these sorts of things. And obviously today we're going to dive into everything thyroid related. So I'm going to assume that a lot of our listeners have listened to the adrenal track, and therefore we won't kind of do the intro today, and we can dive straight into what the thyroid is, what it does, and then go on a little journey in regards to the things that we might need to think about if we're dealing with some thyroid issues. So do you want to start with maybe just a bit of a high level intro into sort of the HPT axis, as some people might think of it as?
Yeah, that sounds like a good starting point. So in that sense, yes, we're talking about the thyroid system, of which the thyroid gland is naturally the centerpiece. But in reality, we want to consider, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid, the HPT axis, as you mentioned, and equally the way that the body then activates the hormones produced by the thyroid gland, so they can actually go to task on doing their job, which is, of course, to determine the metabolic rate of the body. And this is the regulator of metabolic rate across every single cell. So, it determines how we use our energy, how much we are using, and there isn't any area of the body that escapes the influence of the thyroid. And as a consequence, if there's any issues with either thyroid production at the thyroid gland or conversion through the enzyme system that undertakes that task, or equally entry into the cells, then we are always going to see that reflected. And most importantly, that's something that can have such a devastating impact on our ability to respond to a wide range of protocols, interventions, and support that we as practitioners might provide, because if there isn't the energy to make use of what we're giving the body, then it's not going to work out the way we want.
Okay. So with that in mind, I mean, a question that actually comes up is, what are some of the classic signs and symptoms that something might be going on with this system?
So in that regard, it's always going to tie in with energy. So there's some symptoms that are very central, very obvious, very common, for which we would expect low energy, fatigue, but equally areas that require large amounts of energy, these particularly thirsty areas of the body, so especially the front part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, equally certain parts of our immune system, but also digestive tract and the detoxification, cellular healing, any process that is energy intensive but also doesn't keep us alive today is not vital for surviving challenges here and now. Those are the areas that have no other means to be prompted into optimal activity other than receiving that thyroid signal to maintain optimum function. So brain fog is a very common thing that we'll find in these scenarios. So to slow digestive movements, difficulty with maintaining regularity, but also, we see a lot of signs of disinvestment. So that might end up manifesting as dry skin, cold hands and feet, a general intolerance to the cold, reduced hair growth, declines in the quality of our nails, that start splitting more easily. But in the main, we'll also see this pervasive pattern of just things not quite working the way they should, not healing at the speed we might like. So yeah, there's a lot of systemic effects that, whilst individually might be quite subtle, it really does have the accumulative effect of leaving people just not feeling good, feeling low, off the pace, and everything becomes more of an effort.
Mm. And what you've described there is kind of the same principle as the triage theory, which I think that Dr. Bruce Ames kind of discussed, this idea that the body's distributing its resources, whether that might be nutrients or in this case kind of thyroid hormones, to the most important systems, organs, processes in the body, so we stay alive at the cost of other things.
Exactly. It's so intelligent. And of course, you look at, these little subtle interplays between whether it's the thyroid system or even adrenal hormones, particularly adrenaline, the vagus nerve. Yeah, these are the key the key levers that the body uses in order to distribute those resources, give permission to systems to fire up and perform in an optimal way, or of course in the opposite fashion, to revoke permission, so that these areas that are deemed great and important for long-term health but have very little contribution to surviving the day, well, those are the ones that do suffer in that triage system. And the thyroid system is so important to that because of the power it has to increase or indeed limit the amount of energy that will end up being formed and used in each cell, which of course determines metabolic activity.
Okay. So we've kind of introduced the system. We've talked about signs and symptoms that are associated with dysfunction in the system. Maybe what about the testing side of things, so we can understand this kind of sequence of events that takes place from the H to the P to the T to the cell. And I guess that then leads us into a conversation around the nuances and the complexity of actually looking at hormones in the blood and how it's giving us some insight, but certainly not full insight.
Yeah, exactly. I think the testing is a great way to really understand not only that, there is a decent amount of complexity to the system, but also that it's not a black and white thing, which, as with many areas that we end up working with, there so often is this this messaging that implies that people either have thyroid issues or they don't have thyroid issues, rather than recognizing that, like every system, there's a constant state of flux and we're dealing with shades of gray. But also, just importantly, when looking to understand the thyroid system as a whole and looking to understand testing, there's also multiple layers to it. In that regard, I briefly touched on it right when we introduced the topic, but we often end up becoming fixated on, is the thyroid gland producing enough T4, aka thyroxine? And of course, that's a very important factor. And if it's not, then we can very swiftly identify that something's up at the thyroid gland itself. But the vast majority of issues with thyroid activity don't occur as a result of the thyroid gland coming up short. And in that regard, we're much more likely to see problems with either conversion from T4 into T3, which is, of course, the nearly inactive T4 into the active form T3, aka triiodothyronine. And equally, we may well see difficulties in uptake into the cell, which is, of course, where we use phrases like cellular hypothyroidism. And that's a scenario whereby we're going to be potentially misled by the levels that we're seeing in the bloodstream. So it's not a case that testing blood levels is useless. Far from it. It does give us very valuable insight as to what's going on. But we do need to be aware of the factors that might influence the thyroid uptake and ways in which we can actually measure that, quantify that, in order to better understand not only is there an issue here at the thyroid system, but equally, if there is, where is that occurring, at what level? And of course, that allows us to understand what changes we might need to make, what support we might need to provide to make a difference.
Perfect. And if we were to dive into those two kind of key areas, so kind of a conversion issue from T4 to T3, that's something that obviously, well, okay, here's one question, I guess. Is that something which is somewhat clear within blood testing? So is it as simple as saying, well, if you've got good levels of T3 in a blood test, then we know there isn't a conversion issue, or is there some nuance to that? And if there is a conversion issue, what are some of the things we might want to consider?
Yeah, so in the main, yes, if we're seeing good levels of conversion between T4 and T3 in the blood tests, we can be entirely confident that that enzyme system, the deiodinase enzymes, are doing the job we want them to do, and they're actually forming a pleasing amount of the active hormone T3. And so if alternatively, we're seeing that there is a lower level of conversion and we're coming up with T3 that's either at the bottom end of that normal range or indeed even below it, well, that's where, it's really worthwhile considering what is going to be playing a role there. And this is where it's worthwhile recognizing what the deiodinase enzymes do and how they do it, what they respond to. As you can imagine, this is one of the single most important regulatory steps in the entire body. This is going to determine to what extent the body uses up energy, which is the single most vital resource. And so it only makes sense that these deiodinase enzymes will be impacted by a whole range of metabolic signals coming in. Stress hormones can influence their conversion, but so too inflammatory cytokines. So any sort of acute or chronic infection is very relevant here. Equally, things like growth hormone, which now gives us direct connections to sleep quality, so to insulin signaling. So again, insulin sensitivity becomes a concern for us, but so to things like fatty acids, excessive polyunsaturated fats can play a role, oxidative stress can play a role, so to zinc, selenium, iron. So there's definitely a wide range of inputs. And perhaps I should mention probably the most powerful of all, calorific intake. But the key takeaway being that if there's anything up with the metabolic balance, anything whereby there's either a lack of energy available or there's excessive theft of the energy resources through either the inflammatory response or the stress response, we can expect to see that reflected in that activity of this enzyme that forms T3. So this is often where we see that challenge in conversion. We see a slowdown in what's going on there. Then this is a great example of where we want to work backwards. And in most cases, normal clinical screening the most basic steps to building a picture for that individual will give us some very obvious obstacles that are likely contributing to this, and thus we can start building a plan to actually deal with it.
And when you say that a big one is sort of calorific intake, we're saying that a lower than optimal intake is putting a kind of a strain on this system.
Oh, very much so. And it is really worthwhile just lingering on that point, because it's obviously so fundamental, so basic. And yet it's a surprisingly common obstacle to come up. Now, often this will happen because people may well have been subject to such high adrenaline levels for such a long period of time that body has become very much accustomed to how it feels, and they actually end up with all of this excess adrenaline pumping through their system, but it feels very normal to them. But adrenaline does have that potent appetite suppressant effect. In other words, we can often see people gradually accustomed to lower intake. They just don't really have the appetite for more. And of course, with this downregulation in thyroid hormones, it just so happens that they are using less and their system is asking for less. So they end up gradually adjusting to this economy state whereby less is coming in, less is being used, and yet it becomes normal, just like it becomes normal to feel a bit foggy and need that extra coffee. It becomes normal to have dry skin, but hey, just use some extra moisturizing lotions. It becomes normal to struggle with digestion. And of course, as you probably have encountered yourself, we will definitely end up speaking to individuals for whom they will report totally normal digestive function. They possibly pass a stool twice a week, but of course that is normal for them. So just in the same way, eating such tiny meals might become normal for them. And equally, people who have undertaken a lot of dieting often do end up adjusted to that alternative metabolic mode, whereby they're in economy mode. People with digestive issues too, people who are getting bloating, nausea, and other types of discomfort in the gut, they're often very likely not going to get the same hunger signals. And so, as much as in our profession, it is so easy to get complex, to look into the various metabolic pathways, the enzymatic conversion of neurotransmitters, the implication of methylation and its hundreds of targets across the body. We can get so deep, and yet sometimes people just need to eat more.
That's it is really interesting. And sorry for people watching the video. I had a huge bumblebee fly into the room. I had to try and escort it out. But it is as I agree, quite a common thing you see in clinic in regards to people not eating enough. And at least in my experience, that often comes with individuals who are also doing quite a lot of exercise. So again, going back to what you were talking about sort of adrenal function and adrenaline, it's kind of both ends of the spectrum are meaning that this imbalance between calorie intake and expenditure is being broadened by both intake and expenditure, so to speak.
Both sides of the equation. And I think that is a very, very big deal across such a wide range of the people that we work with. And of course, the social media trends, which speak in evangelical tones about intermittent fasting and how wonderful it is. And of course, it's a strategy that does have a whole load of very well identified benefits. I'm not saying it doesn't, but if the system doesn't have the reserves to exploit and tap into those benefits, well, then we're no longer weighing up that dose of stress for that dose of increased autophagy, detoxification, cellular renewal, etc., we're now just inflicting more stress on the body and forcing it into a further shutdown, which somewhat ironically further reduces energy usage, further reduces the appetite. And so often, it does leave us in this cycle where I'll ask everyone who comes to see me at least once at the start to fill out a survey, either using one of the website tools or the apps, to just get some quantification on how much are they eating. And it is, even now, years into seeing these patterns repeat themselves, it's still surprising how many times, we might see people, they've gone from pillar to post to different types of practitioners. They've been thrown to all manner of specialists within the mainstream medical system. They've seen dozens of different practitioners, and they never actually measured their food intake. And they're coming in at 900 calories a day, and nothing good is possible at that level. So it's really, really worthwhile, before we get technical, deep, before we start looking at bringing together a clever and suitable plan. That's normally a really good starting point. Are they eating enough to have a fair chance of their thyroid system being regulated at the level that supports our aims?
Such a good point. Okay, so that's given us a nice long list of things to consider in regards to what influences conversion. It would be, I think, helpful just to touch on the gut a little bit more. And I think one of the reasons being, there's a few quite big names within the space that really kind of talk about, did I freeze at all?
No, all seems
Okay.
Seems good from my end.
There are some big names that talk a lot about kind of the gut thyroid axis and how important the gut is for sort of optimal thyroid function. So is there anything else that we can just expand on there?
Well, and we know that the balance of the microbiome can directly influence thyroid conversion, although I think that it's important to consider the role of the gut in the bigger picture. So in that regard, if we've got a disturbance in that microbial population there, then we are likely going to have an excess of those species that are causing aggravation to the immune system, and thus they are initiating inflammation. So there's a number of indirect effect that's going to naturally affect. We've got millions of vagus nerve endings in the gut lining to constantly sample what's going on at that barrier between us and our body and the environment, which of course the gut is the outside inside. It is still the external environment in all functional ways. So we've got that which can influence mood and sleep and the general sense of aggravation and influence inflammatory tone throughout the body. But so too, if there is excessive inflammation locally, there's that oxidative stress. This is where we are likely to see that separation between the cells that line the gut. And that's where we're getting increased intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut, which is perhaps the single biggest tragedy for anyone looking to maintain optimal thyroid function, because now we're actually permitting this opportunity for contents of the gut to leak into the bloodstream. And specifically what we're talking about there is the endotoxins, also called lipopolysaccharides. And these are little fragments of dead bacteria. So they're not a complete bacteria. They can't cause an infection. But what does happen here is that they've got all of their bacterial barcodes now fully exposed. So the irony is they're actually more capable of aggravating immune activity, inflammation, than a complete bacteria itself. So the endotoxins can have really widespread effects that's not only influencing the hormonal receptors, especially steroid hormone receptors such as cortisol, down regulating it, and that's important to maintain the conversion, something that we'll probably want to touch on shortly, because there's some misconceptions as to the role of cortisol here. But equally, we're going to see this change in the way that the deiodinase system works. Instead of seeing healthy levels of deiodinase 1, which does the job we generally want to see, the conversion of T4 into T3, we're actually going to see a drop in that activity, but a very reliable increase in deiodinase 3, which is a different enzyme that now forms reverse T3, which has zero activity. So it really slams the brakes on what the thyroid system was going to do, and it's going to reduce metabolic rates. And when we look at it in terms of its effect within that bigger picture, it makes so much sense. It's a great energy saver. And the only consequence is that your digestive investment is wrecked. You don't detoxify, you don't regenerate the cell so effectively. Your prefrontal cortex is subject to that disinvestment as well. So your mood is poor, your clarity is missing, you can't plan or learn and generally enjoy life. But hey, that's the only costs. You are in a better place to survive this huge drain of your energy, by which I mean this major activation of the immune system, which is such an energy intensive system. So yes, this is a adaptive measure, but one that leaves us in quite a sorry state most of the time.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay. And then unless there's anything else that you want to add within that sort of topic, shall we say, you kind of did a segue into kind of cortisol and glucocorticoids and maybe some misconceptions here. So what did you mean by that?
Yeah, so I wanted to touch on that just because, there's a very well-established link between cortisol levels and the rate of thyroid conversion. And we can see dozens upon dozens of studies which show when we see populations with high cortisol, we see lower levels of thyroid conversion. So this is absolutely the case, but within that, there's a massive opportunity for misunderstanding that can influence how we help people. Because the inference there is that cortisol is bad and that cortisol reduces the activation of T3. Whereas in reality, what we're seeing whenever somebody is subject to high cortisol is that the cortisol is produced in order to help with the metabolic stresses that they are facing. Therefore, it's often along for the ride. It's there whenever there are metabolic problems. But equally, there is always a very reliable down regulation of your cortisol receptors whenever you have a sustained period of high cortisol. This isn't designed to be pumped out on high levels and sustained at that high level. It's a system that is best used in a cyclical fashion. We don't always do that. In any case, whenever we see this long and sustained phase of high cortisol, the body has an adaptive response to down regulate the receptors, which of course can become maladaptive when it is a chronic situation. And now why am I laboring this point? I'm doing that because when we confuse correlation with causation, it's so easy for us to think, well, cortisol is bad, so we definitely don't want to boost cortisol activity in cases of poor thyroid conversion. And I'll so often speak with people who've run away from supporting the adrenals effectively. And this is, the individuals that I'm working with, but it's also other practitioners. They've run away from providing the adrenal support, no matter how necessary it appears, because they don't want to interfere with that conversion. But the key thing here is that we can see that when we look at adrenalectomy models, when we look at Addison's disease, we will see low conversion, because you need cortisol activity to maintain that at optimal levels. But so too, if you see high levels sustained for long periods of time, you get this downregulation of the receptor, which gives you a paradoxical scenario of having high cortisol and low cortisol activity. A very common finding in anyone with any chronic health challenges. So that's where, if there is some clear need for adrenal support, and we touched on licorice root, Korean ginseng in that last podcast, well, yeah, this can be extremely helpful. So yeah, I just wanted to label that point, because often without that support stabilizing the system, we're not going to be able to maintain that direct supportive signal that cortisol provides for that conversion we want. But also, neither are we going to get sufficient cortisol feedback to the brain, the hypothalamus. And thus, these individuals have no fair chance to turn off the stress response, which is now going to mean more adrenaline, more fatty acids in the system. That's going to reduce thyroid uptake into the cells. It's going to mean more activation of the sympathetic nervous system, opening up of the gut lining. And this is opening channels specifically in the cells of the gut. So not that oxidative stress-induced separation of cells, paracellular permeability. This is actually opening up a channel in the cell, the transcellular permeability. And with that comes the endotoxin loads. With that comes further problems. So yeah, there's a lot of systemic effects that we can avoid with good adrenal support, and ultimately mean that the rest of our support that we're providing for the thyroid can now have a fair chance of doing what we want it to do. So that's why I wanted to labor the point.
Yeah, I mean, that's the huge point ultimately. So thank you for laboring it.
That's what I do.
So you've started to touch on kind of the cellular sensitivity side of things. So I'm imagining there's at least a degree of overlap between some of the things that we've been discussing in regards to what might drive issues with getting this hormone actually into the cell where it's able to do its thing. So do you want to just kind of touch on this sort of almost final part of the pathway?
Yeah, so of course, yeah, having taken the relevant steps to ensure that there's good conversion, good availability of T3, all of that goes to waste if it's not entering the cells effectively. So this is where we want to consider the role of thyroid transport proteins that actually bring in T3 into the cell. And this is probably one of the most under-discussed aspects to the thyroid system, and just so often something that provides us with the clarity we need in individuals who've been going through long-term struggles with all the classic symptoms of low thyroid activity, but just not ever able to get over it, because they're consistently sent away, whether it's mainstream practitioners or alternatives who look at the test results and say, yeah, that's okay, it must be something else. And so, yeah, there's a number of factors that can have unwanted effects at these thyroid transport proteins. Now, probably the most important one is also the most basic, the amount of energy in the cell, that is to say, ATP. If we don't have enough, these cellular transport proteins can't do their job. And it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if the cell is already on low ATP status, well, then the last thing we're going to want is for thyroid hormones to rush in and induce a lot of ATP dependent activities, which is what they do. And so, yes, it's very much that the first checkpoint whenever I'm seeing signs of this cellular hypothyroid picture. So, of course, this is where mitochondrial performance is very much front and center to our concerns, something that you can check on the organic acids test. You can see various markers that signify individual steps in both the Krebs cycle, but also the entry to that Krebs cycle, and also the usage in the electron transport chain, which is actually where the energy is produced. So very useful tool there to screen for any obstacles, anything that would cause a slowdown in ATP production. Those will be vital obstacles to remove, but equally energy intake. If somebody is under eating, or of course over exercising, as you mentioned, they'll often come alongside one another, then that is one of the easiest ways to drain the amount of ATP that we find in each cell. So yeah, so that's always number one consideration. Number two would be any insulin sensitivity issues or high adrenaline. The reason for those is that they drive up the levels of fatty acids in the bloodstream. And the more fatty acids in the bloodstream, the slower the thyroid transport proteins work. Equally, we can get some gut-derived toxins, so fermentation of amino acids that form chemicals, namely CMPF, indoxyl sulfate, hippuric acid. If we've got these pro-fermentation conditions in the gut, then these can easily start accumulating in the bloodstream. Now, we'd hope the kidneys will do their job and grab them and move them out. But again, if there's low cellular energy, then that may not occur at the rate we're after. And these are compounds that have been very well characterized as slowing down the uptake. So technically, we can see bilirubin also slowing that down. That's much less common. But in any case, the key message here is that, low energy status, metabolic shifts, stress, dysbiosis, these can all have a big role to play in impacting how the thyroid transport proteins behave. And so whenever we see those signs, that's a really valuable question for any individual who has all the signs of low thyroid, but yet their blood results are looking great. And so in those scenarios, firstly, I'd suggest that we at least apply some caution when we interpret the blood level of T3 and what that truly means for the individual, but also consider looking at cellular markers such as malic acid that is processed by a thyroid-dependent enzyme. So whenever we see rising levels of malic acid on an organic acids test, well, guess what I suspect?
Interesting. That's a great little clinical pearl. Thank you for that.
No worries. We like to open those shells whenever possible.
And something that came to mind with what you're saying around kind of protein and some of those fermentation biomarkers is, at least theoretically, is that quite common, or certainly there's an increased risk of that in people who are hypothyroid, based on the fact that a lot of people who are hypothyroid have low stomach acid or hypochlorhydria, as well as dysbiosis, slower motility in the gut. And therefore, is this kind of a potential vicious cycle that we may see in some of our clients.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is possibly one of the most important takeaways, in that the way that the human brain is wired, and just as importantly, the way that information is delivered and received over the internet, there's always this focus on looking for the solution, singular. And in human beings, it's almost never a singular solution. Now, occasionally we'll come across people who just need to eat an extra 1,000 calories a day, and in which case, yeah, that might be the closest thing we'll see to a singular solution. But yeah, it's almost always the case that we need to build a fair picture of, what self-perpetuating cycles are at play. How many contributing factors have been unattended to? In other words, how many sources of fuel are we pouring onto this fire? Because we're not going to extinguish it until we actually cut off the fuel that's being poured on there to actually deal with all the contributing factors. And so this is where the concept is always very, very simple. Often building the specific protocol that's going to be both realistic, that's going to be methodical, to reliably tend to each one of these. That's where they can be complex. But that being said, most people will get most of the way simply by tending to the obvious issues. And so, we touched on the adrenal system last time out, and that's often, a huge central role in any long-term challenges on the body, specifically because the adrenals are there to help the body cope and to just turn off the unnecessary stress responses that would otherwise occur. So allow for the resources to actually end up being used in the area and being used in the way that we'd like. But equally, considering things like sleep, considering things like, what's going on in the gut, mitochondrial function, any obvious inflammatory triggers in the environment or in the foods, and then obviously that big old issue of stress. If we were to take a fair and comprehensive look at each one of those areas, as I said, of course it can get more complex, but most people will get most of the way from tending to those. And yes, it often means compensating in the short term, compensating for those challenges, doing what we need to do to maintain good function. But most importantly, it means removing any obstacles and giving us a fair chance.
Yeah, it kind of comes back, I think, to that sort of naturopathic principle of what do we need to add more of and what do we need to take away to allow that sort of innate intelligence to do its thing.
No, definitely. Because, it's a perfect example. Yes, the human body can get very, very complex. And we look at all the multiple targets of various hormones and the huge array of factors that influence how that message is sent out. But the principles remain quite simple. And if you're not sleeping, then let's focus on that. If we're not seeing normal, pleasing, healthy digestive movement, then let's tend to that. If there's any energy issues, well, let's measure what obstacles are there in the mitochondria and take action. Because if we leave any big contributing factor unattended to, then we probably end up following the same path that most thyroid individuals end up going down, which is where, yes, they're getting some help from the thyroid medication that's been provided to them, but it's not brought them back to where they expected, because it hasn't tended to any of those other contributing factors that are still stealing their energy. They're still modifying various functions. They're still loading the system with burdens and forcing that redistribution of energy to help survive. It can't tend to those. It's not designed to. And equally, yeah, they may well get frustrated at that level that they're at, which is a level that allows them to survive and function, but not one that allows them to thrive and truly enjoy themselves. It doesn't bring them back to where they know they can be. And so they try protocol X and doesn't actually do much. Might change the odd test marker or have a minor impact on the odd metric, but they don't really feel any different. So they give up on that protocol and try this other protocol, which is thoroughly dedicated towards the gut. That hasn't done it. So now they look at selenium or zinc supplementation. That doesn't quite do it. And so we're constantly trialing these things that show promise, but again, because it's not a coherent approach that actually removes all the main obstacles at one time, they don't ever have a fair chance of responding and actually switching off those self-perpetuating cycles that ensure low thyroid activity, regardless of what the blood results are telling us.
Okay. And there's one final thing, I guess, from my perspective that comes to mind, and it partly comes back to something you've mentioned here around they go on to maybe some levothyroxine, and it might not be dealing, and most likely isn't dealing, if maybe never really dealing with some of these underlying issues that you've been discussing. And a common journey people find themselves on is that their levothyroxine needs to be increased in dosage over the years, because they seem to be essentially deteriorating, even though they are taking this medication that is supposedly replacing what they're lacking. So what can be going on here?
So that's almost a perfect clue for either one or invariably both of these focus points that we've gone into today. One of poor conversion into T3, and then one of poor uptake into the cells. So in that regard, a little bit of context: the thyroid gland produces roughly 100 micrograms of T4 per day. So in that instance, when we see an individual who's gone to the doctor with slightly low thyroid markers in the bloodstream and we go and correct it, of course it makes sense that in theory you should only need a small boost. You're a bit off, you need a bit of support. So you provide that, and very quickly you go back to where you were. In other words, the body has recognized as more T4 and it's down-regulated the conversion as a result. Or equally, we might end up in another scenario where we go higher and higher and higher. I've seen individuals on 200 micrograms of thyroxine per day. And the frustrating thing is that this is an individual who had been through the system for over a decade. The amount of specialists, including so-called world-leading thyroid specialists, was real long list. And no one at any point had thought, well, hang on, if optimal thyroid production involves the release of around about 100 micrograms a day, and we're giving him 200 and he's still showing all the symptoms of hypothyroidism, maybe there is something else going on besides poor production at the thyroid gland. And so, this is typically where we're going to see a huge resistance to the cellular uptake. That's where we want to take a look at those exact obstacles we've discussed. What's the mitochondrial activity like? What's the insulin sensitivity status? Is there excessive adrenaline driving up those free fatty acids? What about those fermentation chemicals that might be leaking in through the gut and interfering? And yeah, as you might expect, as soon as we tend to those, immediately we're starting to flirt with actual hyperthyroidism. And that's obviously where it does need to be done in concert with the prescribing doctor, and obviously with good communication with the individual, so that yes, they can work with their doctor quickly to keep testing, to adjust accordingly. And yeah, it's a very predictable process. These things don't happen for no reason, even though after over a dozen years within the medical system, this individual had been told that nobody really knows why some people need more T4 than others. And it's shocking to hear that when the data's been around for decades. I mean, we've got studies showing exactly how this works, dating back to the 80s and even earlier in some cases. So that's one particular pattern that we occasionally see. And looking at why it happens suddenly makes it a lot easier to provide the support that's needed.
Absolutely. Marek, that's been brilliant as always. Is there anything that you want to sort of mention that we are yet to discuss, or anything that you just want to conclude with?
I suspect there's probably one other misunderstanding that I see come up here and there, which is as to the role of reverse T3. Again, there's often a tendency towards the black and white thinking that because, yes, we see optimal activity within the metabolism when T3 levels are good and when reverse T3 is low. And of course, that's the desirable situation. But it's very easy to frame reverse T3 as the bad guy, rather than recognize, well, what is its actual role and why is the body choosing to produce more reverse T3? So, of course, on the surface, it's producing the reverse T3 to act as a brake on the metabolism, reduction in energy usage, and saving energy and saving oxygen. And it's very interesting that whenever we see the cellular hypoxia response, that lack of oxygen, that's one of the most powerful activators of that reverse T3 formation. And it's not the only thing that will activate that formation. We'll also see that the calories in, calories out issue can play a role, so too oxidative stress. But ultimately, any signal that tells us we need to conserve our energy or our oxygen is likely to contribute there. And the key thing here is that we often think of reverse T3 as a dead end, and we think of it as something that simply slows the metabolism down. Now, it does slow the metabolism down, but it is also the precursor for T2, which is a really interesting thyroid hormone, and one that generates more activity in the mitochondria, forms more energy in the cell as a consequence, but actually doesn't instigate any metabolic activity in that cell that would use up the energy. So it's a restocking response. It's a highly protective behavior that the body engages in. And that's where, when we see reverse T3 high, that's a scenario where we're so likely to try and out supplement it by asking the doctor to go even higher in T3 to compete with that, and to overwhelm the brakes that reverse T3 is trying to put up, but actually by understanding why it does what it does, in what circumstances it rises. Yeah, this is in essence telling us that the body perceives a distinct need to save energy or oxygen or both. And so our role there is to listen to that message and try and act on it. So I thought that could be worthwhile clarifying, because it's not a bad guy. It's something that the body produces for a very defined purpose. And it does help to, conserve what the body decides needs conserving.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's very interesting. And as you say, I think it has a bad rep generally.
Very much so.
Yeah, excellent. Marek, thank you so much. I'm mindful of your time, but it's been fascinating to dive into the thyroid with you. Along with the adrenals, we're starting to get a really deep understanding about some of these things. I know you're hopefully coming back on the podcast in the not too distant future for another topic.
Well, yes, we can touch on the last of those 3 tiers of the hormonal system. So testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. And don't worry, there's enough complexity there. I'll be laboring plenty of points.
Brilliant. Marek, thank you very much, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you, Alex. Speak to you soon.